The afternoon light filtered through the wide bay windows of our house, golden and soft, wrapping itself around the polished wood floors and the delicate drapes that Daniel insisted on keeping. It was quiet as usual on weekdays when Daniel was at work. For a moment, I let myself revel in the stillness, sipping a cup of tea, surrounded by the faint hum of the city just beyond the gates. Leo had moved back home a year ago after graduating college. His decision had been a practical one, cutting costs, saving for grad school, but it had subtly shifted the rhythm of this house. Daniel had always been an imposing presence, a man of control, a sharp thinker, and an ambitious dreamer. Yet, his relationship with Leo was marked by an unspoken strain, one that I couldn't fully unravel despite my years of studying human behavior. "Why don't you ask Leo to take you?" Daniel had said one morning, his voice light but dismissive as I asked if he could join me for the opening of our agency's gallery exhibit. His attention was already buried in the emails flooding his phone. He's young, energetic, and always willing to help. Leo had never hesitated. Whether it was escorting me to events, helping pick up groceries, or simply sitting across the kitchen table while I reviewed contracts, his easygoing nature made him a stark contrast to his father. 23, Leo had grown into himself, tall, confident, but still carrying that quiet vulnerability he often tried to hide behind his humor. First, I saw our relationship as a simple connection, a bond formed from the absence of tension that Daniel seemed to bring into most conversations. But lately, I'd noticed something shift in the way Leo looked at me. There was a hesitation in his gaze, a quiet reverence that hadn't been there before. And it unnerved me. The unease lingered at the edges of my mind as I rinsed my teacup and set it on the counter. It wasn't just Leo's gaze that had changed, it was his demeanor, the way he carried himself when we were alone. Subtle, almost imperceptible shifts that someone less observant might overlook. He was in the living room when I walked in, scrolling absent-mindedly through his phone, one leg draped over the edge of the couch. His dark hair was tousled, and the hint of a smile played on his lips as though he had just thought of something amusing. The sunlight caught the sharp lines of his jaw, and for a fleeting moment I caught myself staring. "Alessandra," he said, his tone easy and familiar, the kind that immediately filled a room. "You've got that serious look on your face again. What's on your mind?" I shook my head, dismissing the thought. "Just work," I said, moving to straighten the magazines on the coffee table. "You know how it is. You're always working." He leaned back, resting his arms along the back of the couch. His eyes followed me as I tidied unnecessarily. "Do you ever stop and just relax?" "Not often," I admitted with a smile, though his words carried more weight than I was willing to acknowledge. "Well, you should," he said, his voice softening as he tilted his head. "You deserve to." For a moment, the air felt heavier, like something unspoken had been added to the room. His gaze lingered a moment too long, and I felt the faintest heat rise to my cheeks. I quickly busied myself with the papers in my hands, as if the stack of contracts on my desk suddenly couldn't wait another second. "Have you eaten?" I asked, changing the subject. "I was thinking of heading to the market to grab some things for dinner." He smirked, a playful glint in his eyes. "You're not trying to get rid of me, are you?" "Leo," I said, laughing lightly. "I'm serious." "Yeah, I know," he said, standing and stretching, the hem of his t-shirt lifting slightly, revealing a glimpse of his toned abdomen. "I'll come with you. Let me grab my shoes." It was this, his casual familiarity, the ease with which he slid into the quiet corners of my day, that made him so difficult to define. I told myself it was innocent, that I was imagining things. After all, I was his stepmother, not some young woman for him to cast those lingering glances toward. But no matter how many times I repeated the mantra, the tension simmered beneath the surface, refusing to dissolve. The market was lively with its usual hum of conversations and the rhythmic shuffle of feet. Leo walked beside me, tall and easygoing, drawing the occasional glance from strangers. He carried the basket, insisting that I shouldn't lift a finger, though I insisted right back that I was more than capable. Still, he seemed to enjoy the role, following me closely as I pointed out fresh vegetables and delicate cuts of meat. "You're picky about your tomatoes," he teased, holding up one for inspection. "I run a modeling agency," I said with mock seriousness. "Details matter." "Noted." He placed the tomato carefully into the basket and smiled. "Anything else I should know about you, Alessandra?" There was something about the way he said my name, not Mom or any variation of it, but Alessandra, as though we were equals, two people sharing the same space without labels or expectations. "Plenty," I said lightly, brushing past him to pick up a bunch of fresh basil. But you'll have to work for it. His laugh was low and warm, and I realized too late that I had walked directly into his space. Closeness startled me, and I took a step back, only to realize that his hand had risen slightly, brushing against mine in the most fleeting of touches. My breath caught, and I forced a polite smile, turning back to the basil as if nothing had happened. "Careful," he said, his voice quieter now, laced with something I couldn't quite name. "You almost knocked over the basket." I nodded, keeping my focus on the produce. "Thanks for catching it." But even as we moved on, the touch stayed with me, a whisper of something forbidden, something I refused to let take root. Back home, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the house, I found myself in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. The rhythmic motion was grounding, a distraction from the thoughts swirling in my head. Leo was upstairs, likely sprawled across his bed, and Daniel wouldn't be home until late. It was one of those rare evenings when the silence in the house felt charged, like it was holding its breath. I barely registered the sound of footsteps behind me until Leo's voice broke the quiet. "Need help?" I turned, startled, to see him leaning against the doorframe, his expression casual but his eyes intent. The setting sun painted him in warm tones, and for a moment I forgot to respond. "No," I said quickly, returning to the cutting board. "I'm fine. Come on," he said, moving closer. "Let me do something. You always take care of everything." "You're sweet," I said, glancing at him, trying to keep the tone light. "But I've got it under control." He stepped beside me, reaching for the knife I held. His hand brushed mine again, and I froze. "Alessandra," he said softly, his voice suddenly different, deeper. "Why won't you let anyone take care of you?" The knife slipped from my hand, landing with a soft clatter on the cutting board. My breath was shallow, and I couldn't meet his gaze. The words felt like a confession, but also an accusation, peeling back layers I didn't want to expose. "I'm fine," I said again, but my voice wavered. Leo didn't move, his presence warm and unyielding beside me. And in that moment, I felt the fragile boundary between us bending, creaking under the weight of everything left unsaid. The first kiss happened in a rush of emotions neither of us could control. It was during the photo shoot, a day meant to be professional, structured, and safe, everything I had worked to build my life around. Yet, in a single moment, the structure crumbled. After Daniel suggested Leo consider modeling, he had laughed it off initially. "Modeling? Me? I'm not exactly the runway type," he'd said with a self-deprecating smile. But I could see the glimmer of curiosity in his eyes, the same way I had seen it in so many others who never thought they had a chance until someone believed in them. "It's not just about looks, Leo," I told him one evening as we sat in the kitchen. "It's about confidence, adaptability, and telling a story with your presence. You have that." He tilted his head, watching me in that way that always felt too intense, like he could see past my words and into the spaces I kept hidden. "You really think so?" I nodded, refusing to let the weight of his gaze unnerve me. "If you're interested, I'll help you put together a portfolio and submit it to a few agencies. No pressure, but I think you'd surprise yourself." Daniel was thrilled at the idea. "If Alessandra thinks you've got potential, listen to her. She knows this industry better than anyone. And it'll be good for you, Leo, a chance to learn, maybe find some direction." So Leo agreed. Over the next few weeks, we worked together to build his portfolio. He was hesitant at first, nervous about being in front of the camera, but something about the process brought out a side of him I hadn't seen before, a boldness, a willingness to push past his insecurities. I taught him how to pose, how to relax his jawline, and how to hold a gaze with the camera that made it impossible to look away. He was a quick learner, soaking in every word and adjusting with a precision that impressed even me. We scheduled the final shoot in my studio. I had a trusted photographer lined up, and everything was set. As I adjusted the lighting and helped him with wardrobe choices, I felt the tension in the air, an energy that had nothing to do with the work at hand. I could feel his eyes on me as I smoothed the collar of his shirt, his chest rising and falling just a little too quickly. "You're doing great," I said softly, stepping back to admire the effect of the crisp white shirt against his olive-toned skin. "Because I have the best teacher," he replied, his voice low and warm, the corner of his mouth tilting into a smile that made my heart stumble. When the shoot began, Leo came alive in front of the camera. He had a natural charisma that was impossible to ignore, and I could see the photographer nodding in quiet approval. By the time we wrapped up, I was certain we had everything we needed to submit his application. "Thank you," Leo said as we packed up the equipment. "For all of this, for believing in me." I waved him off, trying to keep things light. "You did the hard work. I just gave you a nudge." "No, Alessandra." His voice stopped me in my tracks. "You didn't just give me a nudge. You made me see myself differently." I turned to him, trying to ignore the warmth rising to my cheeks. "That's my job." But before I could step away, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. "You're more than just my stepmother," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've always been more than that to me." The words hung between us, heavy and impossible to take back. I opened my mouth to respond, to say something that would push us back into safe territory, but then he leaned forward, his lips finding mine in a kiss that was both tentative and electrifying. For a moment I froze, caught between the undeniable pull and the knowledge that this was a line we couldn't cross. But when I felt the warmth of his hand on my cheek, the restraint I had clung to so fiercely faltered. I pulled away first, my breath shaky as I stepped back. "Leo," I said, my voice unsteady. We can't." "I know," he said quickly, regret flashing in his eyes. "I know it's wrong. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration spilling into his tone. "I couldn't help it." "We need to focus on your career," I said firmly, though my heart felt like it was pounding out of my chest. This can't happen again." Tension didn't dissolve after that day, but we both threw ourselves into the practical tasks at hand. When his application was accepted, and the agency invited him to an audition, the look on Leo's face was enough to make my resolve weaken all over again. He had always been handsome, but now there was a confidence in his smile that made him almost unrecognizable. After the audition, we sat in the car, the silence heavy with anticipation. When his phone buzzed with the news that he had been accepted, his joy was palpable. "They said yes," he said, his voice almost disbelieving. "I got in." I smiled, the pride in my chest swelling despite everything. "I told you they'd see what I see." Without warning, he leaned over, his hands gripping mine as he pressed a quick, joyful kiss to my lips. It wasn't calculated or hesitant, just pure, unrestrained happiness spilling over. But when he pulled back, his expression softened, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. He began, but I shook my head. "Let's just focus on celebrating this moment," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. For the rest of the drive, we didn't speak of it. But the air between us felt charged, and I knew that no matter how hard I tried to suppress it, we had crossed into uncharted territory. After Leo's acceptance into the agency, things began to shift in ways I couldn't fully control. The dynamic between us, once easy and casual, had deepened into something unspoken but undeniable. Daniel was thrilled with Leo's progress, often remarking on how much his son had matured. "It's good for him," he'd say, with that easy smile of his. "You've been a great influence, Alessandra." "Thank you." Those words struck me every time. They were meant as praise, but they felt like a reminder of the precarious line I was walking, a line I had already crossed more than once. And yet, I found myself drawn closer to Leo despite my best efforts to maintain distance. Our relationship grew in the quiet, stolen moments between the chaos of life. Late-night conversations on the patio, when Daniel had gone to bed and the world felt hushed. Trips to the studio where I coached him on how to hold his angles under the harsh glare of the camera. Even casual dinners, where his hand would linger a second too long against mine as we passed the serving dishes. It was all so subtle, yet it burned with an intensity one couldn't ignore. One evening, as I stood by the large bay windows of the house, the city lights glittering like stars in the distance, I felt a familiar presence behind me. I didn't have to turn around to know it was Leo. His quiet, measured steps were etched into my memory. "You're always lost in thought," he said softly, stepping beside me. "What is it tonight?" I glanced at him, my smile small and tired. "Nothing. Just thinking." "You're terrible at lying," he teased, a playful warmth in his voice that softened the tension between us. I turned back to the window, but I felt him watching me. His presence was magnetic, pulling me into an orbit I had tried so desperately to escape. "You should be focusing on your career," I said finally, trying to steer the conversation away from dangerous waters. "You've got another shoot next week." "I know." His voice was quieter now, more serious. "But I can't stop thinking about us." I closed my eyes, gripping the edge of the window frame as if it could steady me. "Leo." "Alessandra, stop pretending this isn't happening," he interrupted, his voice firmer now. I know you feel it too. Don't tell me you don't. His words hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. I turned to face him, the intensity in his gaze pinning me in place. This is wrong, I whispered, though my voice lacked conviction. I'm your stepmother. You're not my mother, he said, his tone steady and unyielding. You've never been my mother. You're you. I shook my head, but the tears stinging my eyes betrayed me. Leo, this could destroy everything. Your father. My father doesn't see you, he said, his voice raw with frustration. Not the way I do. He doesn't notice the way you carry everything on your shoulders, how you're always thinking about everyone else before yourself. I see it, Alessandra. I see you. My breath hitched at his words, and for a moment I hated him for the truth in them. Daniel was a good man, a loyal husband, but he had never looked at me the way Leo did now, as if I were the center of his universe. I can't do this, I said, my voice breaking. Leo, we can't. But even as I said the words, he stepped closer, closing the distance between us. His hand reached out, hesitating for only a second before brushing against my cheek. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me, and I hated how much I craved it. I'm not asking for anything, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I need you to know how I feel. I looked up at him, my resolve crumbling under the weight of his confession. There was no denying the truth anymore. I had tried to push him away, to convince myself that this was just a fleeting infatuation, but the connection between us was too strong to ignore. Before I could think, before I could stop myself, I leaned forward, my lips brushing against his. Kiss was soft at first, tentative and filled with hesitation, but it quickly deepened as the floodgates broke open. For a moment, the world fell away, leaving only the two of us tangled in a moment we could never take back. When we finally pulled apart, I searched his eyes for something, regret, confusion, anything to match the chaos in my chest. But all I saw was certainty. This changes everything, I whispered, my voice trembling. I know, he said, his hands still cradling my face. And I don't care. In the days that followed, our connection grew even stronger. We were careful, always careful, but the boundaries that once seemed so impenetrable had all but dissolved. Leo's modeling career took off quickly. The agency loved his fresh, dynamic energy, and he quickly became a sought-after face for campaigns. Daniel was ecstatic, bragging to anyone who would listen about his son's newfound success. He's lucky to have you, Daniel told me one evening over dinner, his smile warm and genuine. You've been a mentor to him, Alessandra. The weight of his words pressed against my chest like a vice. If only he knew the truth. As Leo's official representative, I worked closely with him, attending meetings and shoots, negotiating contracts, and ensuring that his career was on the right track. But every stolen glance, every accidental touch felt like a secret whispered into the void. The nights were the hardest. I would lie awake in bed, listening to the quiet hum of the house, knowing Leo was just down the hall. Temptation to knock on his door, to lose myself in the safety of his arms, was almost unbearable. But I knew the risks, and I couldn't let my weakness destroy the life I had built. Still, the moments we shared, however fleeting, were enough to keep the fire burning. A shared smile across the dinner table. His hand brushing against mine as he passed me a folder. The way he said my name, low and intimate, as if it were a secret only we shared. It was dangerous, intoxicating, and utterly impossible to resist. The ocean stretched out endlessly before us, its rhythmic waves brushing against the pristine shore as the sun dipped low in the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. It was Daniel's idea to send Leo and me to this secluded resort, an extravagant gift he'd received but couldn't use because of mounting work deadlines. It's perfect, he had said with a wave of his hand, barely looking up from his laptop. You two could use a break, and Alessandra, you'll know exactly how to help Leo network with the right people while you're there. I had nodded, keeping my expression neutral, though my heart was already racing. I told myself that it was just a trip, a professional opportunity for Leo, nothing more. But as we arrived at the resort, greeted by the salty air and the soft rustle of palm trees, I couldn't ignore the charged tension that lingered between us. The first few days were a whirlwind of activity. I introduced Leo to the resort staff and other guests, subtly coaching him on how to navigate social situations with charm and tact. He was a natural, soaking up my advice and putting it to use effortlessly. Dinners, he'd lean in and whisper a joke or observation that would make me laugh, the warmth of his presence settling over me like the sun. You know, he said one evening as we walked along the beach, the moon casting its silver glow across the waves. You're incredible at this. Reading people, knowing exactly what they want to hear. You make it look so easy. I smiled, brushing a strand of hair from my face as the breeze picked up. It's not about saying what people want to hear, Leo. It's about making them feel seen, understood. Everyone craves connection. Is that what you do with me? He asked, his voice softer now. Make me feel seen? I stopped walking, the weight of his questions settling over me. The way he looked at me, intense, unguarded, left me breathless. Leo, I began, but he interrupted. You don't have to answer, he said quickly, taking a step closer. I already know. You've always seen me, Alessandra. Even when no one else did. Our affair began that night, under the stars and the quiet hum of the ocean. It wasn't planned, it wasn't something we had spoken about. Simply happened, a culmination of all the stolen moments and unspoken desires that had simmered between us for months. Leo kissed me first, his hands trembling slightly as they cupped my face, and for the first time I didn't push him away. It was impossible to resist the pull of him, his earnestness, his overwhelming need to prove himself. He listened to everything I said, his eyes never leaving mine, as though each word I spoke was a revelation. I taught him more than just social techniques. I taught him how to observe people, how to understand them in ways that made connections deeper and more meaningful. I taught him how to express himself, how to carry his confidence without arrogance. And when we were alone, when no one could see, he used those lessons on me. He made me feel like the center of his world, like I was the only person who mattered. It was intoxicating and terrifying all at once. I knew it couldn't last, but I let myself fall into the illusion just for a little while. When we returned from the resort, things grew more complicated. We both knew the affair had to end, but neither of us could quite let go. Leo's career was flourishing. He was booking campaigns and shoots faster than we could manage them, but he still found time to seek me out, to linger in the quiet spaces where no one could overhear us. Daniel, for his part, seemed oblivious, though there were moments when I caught him watching us a little too closely, his expression unreadable. You've done wonders with him, he said one evening as we sat on the patio, the glow of the city lights reflecting in his glass of whiskey. Leo's more confident, more sure of himself. That's all because of you. I forced a smile, guilt clawing at my chest. He's always had it in him, I said. He just needed someone to believe in him. Daniel nodded, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that told me he suspected more than he let on. The affair ended not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet understanding. We both knew it couldn't continue. I was Daniel's wife and Leo was his son. The lines we had crossed couldn't be erased, but they also couldn't be redrawn. One evening, as we sat in the studio after a late shoot, Leo turned to me, his expression filled with a kind of resigned sadness. I don't regret any of it, he said, his voice steady. Not a single moment. Neither do I admitted, my heart breaking even as I said the words. But it has to stop. He nodded, though the pain in his eyes was impossible to ignore. You were my first love, he said softly. You'll always be the first. And you'll always be special to me, I replied, my voice trembling. But this isn't our story, Leo. It never was. In the months that followed, Leo threw himself into his career with a renewed focus, channeling his emotions into his work. He grew into the man I always knew he could be, strong, confident, and self-assured. And though our affair remained a secret, I could see in Daniel's eyes that he knew. But Daniel never confronted us. Perhaps he understood that it was a chapter that had closed, a mistake that had been made but wouldn't be repeated. Or perhaps he trusted me enough to know that I wouldn't let it destroy our family. In the end, Leo became a better man because of what we shared. He learned how to love, how to connect, how to see the world through a lens of empathy and understanding. And though our relationship had ended, the lessons remained. For me, Leo would always be a part of my story, a forbidden, beautiful memory that shaped us both. He was my student, my partner, my greatest temptation. And though we had let go, the love we shared would never truly fade.